If someone had told me a year ago that my meticulously curated, silent, solitary life, would be upended by a thunderstorm and the neighbor's son, I would have laughed. Not a real laugh, but the dry, rustling sound that passed for one in the quiet of my apartment. My life was a fortress, built brick by brick with routine and emotional distance. And from the highest window of that fortress, I watched him. Julian. He was not a person to me. Not really. He was a force of nature, a disruption in the placid landscape of my suburban street. My days were measured in keystrokes and coffee cups. I was a graphic designer, a ghost in the machine of corporate branding, working from a home that was more sanctuary than house. The walls were pale gray, the furniture minimalist. Everything had its place. My heart, I suppose, had its place too, tucked away in a dusty box on a high shelf where it couldn't get bruised. Solitude was not a punishment. It was a carefully constructed peace treaty I had signed with the world. It was safe. It was predictable. Julian was neither of those things. He lived next door with his mother, in a little blue house with the overgrown rose bushes. He was a landscaper, or a mechanic, or something that involved dirt and sweat and the loud rumble of a truck engine that often shattered the morning calm. He was a collection of sensory data points from my second-story window, the sun catching the dark sweep of his hair, the corded muscles in his forearms as he lifted something heavy, the easy, confident stride that seemed to claim the very ground he walked on. He was, to my anxious and over-analytical mind, an antagonist. He was loud where I was quiet. He was physical where I was cerebral. He existed so completely in the world, in his body, while I felt like a phantom observing it all from behind glass. I manufactured a kind of low-grade resentment for him, a defense mechanism against the pull he exerted. It was easier to be annoyed by the roar of his truck than to admit I was captivated by the man driving it. This was the status quo. The distance was a chasm, defined by a pane of glass, a stretch of lawn, and a universe of my own making. He was the sun, and I was a creature of the shadows, content to observe its warmth without ever risking a burn. The disruption, when it came, arrived on a wave of bruised purple clouds and the smell of ozone. The weather reports had called for a storm, but this was something else entirely. This was a biblical event, a tantrum thrown by the sky. The wind howled, a mournful beast clawing at the windows. Rain didn't fall. It came in solid, wind-driven sheets that blurred the world into an impressionist nightmare. My routine was shattered. I couldn't focus on the clean lines of a logo when the world outside was chaos. So I did what I always did. I watched. I watched the great oak tree in his mother's yard, a tree that had stood for a century, thrashing its limbs like a drowning man. There was a sickening crack, a sound that felt like it tore the fabric of the evening, followed by a shower of blue-white sparks as a massive branch surrendered to the wind and fell across the power line. The lights in the blue house blinked once, twice, and then died. My own flickered but held, a small victory in the face of the tempest. For a few minutes, there was nothing but the storm. Then, a beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness from their porch. I saw Julian's silhouette, broad and tense, moving with a frantic energy that was entirely new. I saw him run back inside, then out again. The panic was a palpable thing, even from my distant perch. It radiated from him, a frantic signal in the howling dark. My fortress felt very far away, suddenly. Then came a knock on my door. It was not a polite rap. It was a frantic, desperate pounding that seemed to shake the whole building. My heart, that dusty, shelved-away thing, hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. No one ever knocked on my door. My world was one of emails and delivery notifications left on the mat. This was an intrusion, a violation of the treaty. I opened it a crack, the security chains still in place. And there he was, not the confident, arrogant figure from my window, but a stranger. His hair was plastered to his forehead with rain. His shirt was soaked through, clinging to the hard lines of his chest. But it was his eyes that held me. They were wide, frantic, stripped of all their usual swagger. He was just scared. "My mom," he said, his voice ragged, breathless. "The power's out. Her oxygen machine. It's on a battery backup, but it won't last all night." Can I please? Can I run an extension cord from your place? The chasm between us vanished. It was filled by the rain and the wind and the raw, desperate need in his voice. The carefully constructed distance, the years of silent observation and manufactured resentment, they all collapsed in an instant. This was no longer an antagonist. This was a terrified son. Yes, I said, my own voice sounding foreign. Of course. Come in. I fumbled with the chain, my hands suddenly clumsy. He stepped inside, and the storm came with him. He brought the smell of rain and wet earth and something else, something uniquely him, into my sterile, quiet space. He was too big for my hallway, too real for my ghost world. He dripped on the hardwood floor, a puddle forming at his feet, and for the first time in years, I didn't care about the mess. We were a clumsy ballet of frantic purpose. I found the longest, heaviest-duty extension cord I owned, the one I kept for yard work I never did. He took it, his fingers brushing against mine as I passed it to him. It was nothing, a flicker of contact. But for me, it was a lightning strike, a jolt of pure, unadulterated heat that shot up my arm and detonated somewhere in my chest. My breath hitched. I pulled my hand back as if burned. Did he notice? I couldn't read his expression. He was already focused on the task, his brow furrowed in concentration. I watched from my doorway as he worked, a strange sense of unreality washing over me. He braved the storm again, running the thick orange cord from my porch outlet, across the drenched lawn, and through his mother's window. The logistics were a nightmare. We had to leave my kitchen window cracked open for the cord, a constant, chilling reminder of the chaos outside. A damp, cold draft snaked into my perfectly climate-controlled apartment. It felt like a violation. It felt like living. When he came back inside, he was shivering, his entire body trembling with cold and adrenaline. The swagger was completely gone, replaced by a profound weariness that seemed to settle deep in his bones. He stood in my kitchen, looking lost, out of place. This was my domain, the quiet, orderly world he had just breached. And for the first time, I felt something other than intimidation or longing when I looked at him. I felt capable. "You're freezing," I said. The words were simple, declarative, an observation, but they felt like a bridge. "I'll make some coffee, and you need to get out of those wet clothes." He looked down at himself, as if noticing for the first time that he was soaked to the skin. Yeah. Okay." I gave him a towel and a spare set of sweatpants and a t-shirt, items that had sat folded in my dresser for years, untouched. They would be too small for him, I knew, but they were dry. While he changed in the bathroom, I moved with an efficiency that surprised me. I put the kettle on. I mopped up the puddle on the floor. I was taking care of things. I was taking care of him. The power dynamic had been completely inverted. He, the strong, capable man of action, was now the one in need, and I, the quiet observer, was the one providing shelter from the storm. He emerged from the bathroom, and the sight of him sent another tremor through me. My gray t-shirt was tight across his broad chest and shoulders, the sleeves straining around his biceps. The sweatpants were too short, ending mid-calf, revealing strong ankles. He looked ridiculous. He looked incredible. He had scrubbed the towel over his hair, and it stood up in dark, unruly tufts. He looked younger, more vulnerable. The man from my window was an archetype. The man in my kitchen was just a person. A tired, worried person wearing my clothes. I handed him a mug of coffee. Our fingers brushed again, this time for a fraction of a second longer. The heat was still there, a low, persistent hum. He wrapped his large, calloused hands around the ceramic, as if absorbing the warmth directly into his bloodstream. I noticed the details I could never see from my window. A faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow. The tiny lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. The way his knuckles were perpetually scraped and bruised. These were the marks of a life lived, a life of effort and impact. My own hands, by contrast, were smooth and pale, accustomed only to the click of a mouse and the warmth of a keyboard. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. He wouldn't meet my eyes, staring down into the black coffee instead. "Seriously, you really saved us tonight. It's nothing. I replied, the automatic dismissive phrase feeling hollow and untrue. It was everything. It was the shattering of a world. The night stretched on, long and strange. The storm raged outside, a constant percussive soundtrack to the silent tension inside my apartment. We sat in the living room, the only light coming from a single floor lamp that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The hum of his mother's oxygen machine was a faint, distant metronome, a reminder of the reason he was here, in my space, breathing my air. We didn't talk much at first. The silence was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that settled over us. But it was different from my usual silence. My silence was a choice, a comfort. This was a silence born of awkwardness and unspoken things, thick with the presence of another person. My heart felt like it was doing acrobatics in my chest, a frantic performance for an audience of one. He's here. He's right here. Eventually, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving a raw, frayed exhaustion in its wake. It was Julian who broke the silence, his voice startlingly loud in the quiet room. "I always see you," he said, not looking at me, but at the window, at the rain-streaked darkness beyond. In this window, watching, my blood ran cold, a stomach full of bees. He knew. He'd always known. The shame was a hot flush that crawled up my neck. I had been a creep, a weirdo staring from his lonely tower. I work from home," I stammered, the excuse sounding pathetic even to my own ears. "My desk is right there." He finally turned to look at me, and his expression wasn't angry or accusatory. It was something else, something I couldn't decipher. "Yeah, I figured. Still, you always look so, I don't know, pissed off. Like you hated the sound of my truck or something." My mind reeled. Pissed off? Hated him? It was so far from the truth. It was almost funny. The emotion I felt when I watched him was a complex, tangled knot of longing, envy, and a deep, aching loneliness. It was a feeling so potent I had to disguise it, even to myself, as annoyance. It was safer that way. "No," I said, the word coming out as a whisper. "That's not it." "Then what was it?" he asked, his gaze direct, pinning me to the sofa. There was no escape. The storm outside, the dim light, the intimacy of the small room, it was a crucible. And the truth, or a version of it, just fell out of me. I was intimidated. He blinked. A genuine, unfeigned look of shock crossed his face. Intimidated? Of me? Why? How could I explain it? How could I articulate the chasm I perceived between us? "You just seem so at ease," I said, struggling for the words. "In the world, you fix things. You build things. You're present. I'm not. I live up here, behind a screen. It's different." A humorless laugh escaped him. It was a short, sharp sound. "At ease? Man, you have no idea." He ran a hand through his damp hair, a gesture of profound stress. "I'm so far from at ease, I don't even know what it looks like anymore. My mom's sick. The business is barely scraping by. This truck you think I love so much, the transmission is shot, and I have no idea how I'm going to pay for it. I'm drowning." Most days, the confession hung in the air between us, raw and shocking. The confident, arrogant man I had invented, the one who strode across the earth with such purpose, was a fiction. He was just as lost as I was. Only his struggles were external, tangible things, broken engines and mounting bills, while mine were internal, a quiet war waged within the confines of my own skull. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. "I didn't know. How could you?" he said with a shrug. "Nobody does. I'm good at playing the part. The strong son. The guy who can handle it." He finally met my eyes again, and the vulnerability, there was a physical blow. It's exhausting. We sat in the new silence, one that was no longer awkward, but filled with a shared, fragile humanity. The storm had stripped away our facades, leaving us exposed. He wasn't the brute I'd imagined, and I wasn't the judgmental hermit he'd assumed. We were just two men, trapped by a storm, admitting we were scared. I don't know how long we sat there. Time seemed to warp and bend in the dimly lit room. The rain began to soften, its frantic drumming easing into a steady, gentle patter. The worst of it was over. He shifted on the couch, turning his body slightly towards me. The movement was small, but it changed the entire geometry of the room. The space between us shrank, charged with a new kind of energy. It was no longer about fear or vulnerability. It was something else, something tentative and hopeful. "Leo," he said, and the sound of my own name from his lips was a revelation. I don't think he'd ever said it before. "Julian," I replied, my voice barely audible. He reached out, his movements slow, deliberate, giving me an eternity to pull away. His hand came to rest on my knee. The simple weight of it, the warmth seeping through the thin cotton of my sweatpants, was overwhelming. My entire nervous system lit up. Every thought in my head dissolved into pure sensation. The rough texture of his calluses against the fabric, the solid, grounding pressure of his palm. My breath caught in my throat. I looked from his hand on my knee to his face. His eyes were dark, searching mine for what? Permission? Rejection? I didn't know. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I only knew that the thought of him moving his hand away was unbearable. So I did something brave, or maybe something foolish. I leaned in, just an inch, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift, but it was enough. His eyes widened slightly, and then he was moving too, closing the remaining distance between us. His other hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking gently against my cheek. The gesture was so tender it almost broke me. No one had touched me with such care in years. His kiss was not what I would have expected. It wasn't hard or demanding or confident. It was hesitant, questioning. It was a soft pressure of lips, a shared breath, a moment of profound, terrifying stillness. It was a question, and I answered by kissing him back, by tilting my head and letting my own hand come up to rest on his chest, where I could feel the frantic, unsteady beat of his heart. It was just as wild as mine. The strong, silent type. The man who was so at ease in the world. His heart was a frantic trapped bird, same as mine. The world narrowed to that single point of contact. The scent of him, rain and soap and something warm and musky. The scratch of his stubble against my skin. The incredible, impossible softness of his lips. It was a kiss that rewrote years of silent observation, years of loneliness. It wasn't about passion, not yet. It was about recognition. "Oh, there you are. I see you." When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. I could feel the slight tremor in his hands. "I wanted to do that," he whispered, the admission so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it. For a long time, the world tilted on its axis. "You have. Every time I saw you in that window," he breathed. "I just wonder what you were thinking. Who you were." He pulled back just enough to look at me, a small, wry smile touching his lips. Turns out I had it all wrong, so did I. I admitted, a genuine smile finding its way to my own face. It felt rusty and used. So did I. We didn't talk much more after that. The words had been said. The barriers had been broken. He eventually moved to the other end of the couch, giving us both some space to breathe. I gave him a blanket. Sometime in the deep, quiet hours of the morning, lulled by the gentle rain and the impossible reality of Julian sleeping just a few feet away, I drifted off. I woke to silence. A profound, absolute silence. The rain had stopped. The wind was gone. And more than that, the low, persistent hum from the extension cord was absent. Sunlight, sharp and clean, streamed through the window, glinting off dust motes dancing in the air. The apartment was empty. Julian was gone. My heart plummeted. A cold, heavy dread pooled in my stomach. I sat up, my body stiff. The blanket I'd given him was folded neatly on the arm of the sofa. The coffee mug was gone from the table. I walked to the kitchen. It was in the drying rack by the sink, washed and clean. I looked out the window. The sky was a brilliant, scrub-clean blue. The power was on in the little blue house next door. And on my porch, the extension cord was coiled perfectly, lying next to the door like an offering. No note, no text, nothing. He was just gone, as if the whole night had been a fever dream, a hallucination brought on by the storm. But the indentation on the couch cushion was real. The scent of him, faint but still present in the air, was real. The memory of his lips on mine was painfully, achingly real. The anxiety came on like a tidal wave, swift and suffocating. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. He regrets it. He was just stressed and vulnerable, and you took advantage. My own mind turned on me, a vicious practice traitor. The self-recrimination was a spiral, pulling me down into a dark, familiar place. The fortress walls went back up, brick by painful brick. I had been a fool to let him in. I had let my guard down for one night, and this was the price. Rejection. A silent, clean departure that was somehow more brutal than angry words would have been. I retreated back into my routine. I made coffee. I sat at my desk. I stared at the logo on my screen, but the lines were just meaningless shapes. My focus was gone, shattered. My sanctuary now felt like a cage. The silence I once cherished now a booming, deafening emptiness. His absence was a presence, a ghost sitting on the couch, a phantom warmth on my knee. My solitude, once a source of comfort, was now just loneliness, pure and simple. The first day was agony. Every time I heard a car door, my head would snap up, my heart leaping with a stupid, desperate hope, only to crash back down when it wasn't his truck. I watched from my window, my old habit now a form of self-torture. I saw him once in the afternoon, loading equipment into his truck bed. He moved with his old confidence, the weariness from the night before seemingly vanished. He never once looked toward my window. It was like I didn't exist, like the night before had been wiped from his memory. Or worse, that he was actively, deliberately ignoring me. The second day was worse. The sharp sting of anxiety dulled into a deep, heavy ache. A resignation. This is what you get, I told myself. This is why you don't let people in. The world is full of storms and sparks, and all they do is leave you in the dark when they're gone. I try to work. I try to lose myself in pixels and palettes, but the ghost of him was everywhere. In the scent of the coffee, in the gray t-shirt now back in my drawer, in the silence. By the third day, I had almost convinced myself it was for the best. I would rebuild. I would reinforce the walls. The memory would fade. The ache would dull. I would go back to being the man in the window, the observer. It was safer. I was just putting the final touches on a design, forcing myself to focus on the curve of a letter when I heard it. A knock on the door. Not the frantic pounding of the storm, but a quiet, hesitant rap. 2 soft knocks. My blood turned to ice. It couldn't be. My mind was playing tricks on me. Hope is a dangerous, cruel thing. I didn't move. Maybe if I stayed quiet, it would go away. The ghost would dissipate. Another knock, a little firmer this time. I walked to the door like a man walking to his own execution. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. I didn't look through the peephole. I didn't want the forewarning. I just needed to know. I opened the door. It was him. He looked terrible, worse than he had in the storm. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his jaw was tight with a tension that seemed to vibrate through his whole body. He wasn't wearing his work clothes, just a pair of jeans and a faded black hoodie. In his hand, he was clutching the cardboard carrier of a 6-pack of beer so tightly his knuckles were white. We just stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between us, thick with everything that had happened and everything that hadn't. He was the one to finally speak, his voice rough. Can I come in? I should have said no. For my own self-preservation, I should have closed the door and locked it. But I couldn't. I just stepped aside, holding the door open. He walked past me into the living room, the same space where we had kissed, and stood in the middle of the floor, looking as lost as he had the other night. He wouldn't look at me. I'm sorry, he said, his voice low, directed at the floorboards. For just leaving. That was a chicken shit move. I closed the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. I thought you regretted it. The words were out before I could stop them, a raw admission of my fear. He finally looked up at me, and the anguish in his eyes was so real it stole my breath. Regretted it? Leo. I haven't been able to think about anything else. He took a step closer. I freaked out. I woke up, and the sun was out, and everything was quiet, and you were sleeping there. And it all just felt too much. Too real. I don't do that. I don't feel that. Feel what? I whispered, needing to hear him say it. That, he said, gesturing vaguely between us. Whatever that was, it scared the hell out of me. I thought I must have imagined it, or that I'd crossed some line. I thought you'd wake up and hate me for it. So I ran. It's what I do. When things get real, I run. The relief that washed over me was so intense it made my knees weak. He wasn't rejecting me. He was just as scared as I was. We were two sides of the same coin. I built walls to keep people out. He ran away before they could get too close. I didn't hate you, I said, my voice shaking slightly. I thought you hated me. I spent the last 3 days convincing myself I'd imagined the whole thing. A small, sad smile touched his lips. So we're both idiots, seems that way. I agreed, a real smile, a hopeful smile, finally returning to my face. He held up the six-pack. I brought a peace offering. Figured it was the least I could do. You don't have to bribe your way in. Julian, I know, he said, his gaze serious and tense. This isn't a bribe. It's an excuse. I needed an excuse to come back. To see if I had completely screwed this up. He took another step, closing the distance until he was standing right in front of me. Did I? This was it. The moment of truth. The moment for bravery. The old me would have retreated, made a joke, deflected. But the old me was a ghost. The storm had washed him away. No, I said, my voice clear and steady. You didn't screw it up. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. The tension visibly drained from his shoulders. He set the beers down on the entryway table, and then he reached out, not for my knee this time, not for my face, but for my hand. He laced his fingers through mine. His hand was large and warm and real. It was an anchor in the swirling chaos of my emotions. Good, he whispered. That's good. He looked around my apartment, at the neat, orderly silence of it all. Can I stay? For a while? Not because there's a storm or an emergency. Just to stay. It was the simplest question, but it held the weight of 1,000 promises. He was asking to cross the threshold, not as a desperate neighbor, but as something more. He was choosing to be here, with me. Yeah, I said, my voice thick with emotion. You can stay. And so the new beginning started not with a bang, but with the quiet hiss of 2 beer bottles being opened in a sunlit living room. We sat on the couch, a comfortable distance between us, but our hands remained linked on the cushion. We talked for hours. We talked about his mom, about my work, about his busted truck, about my stupid, lonely routines. We filled in the silhouettes we had created of each other with the messy, complicated details of real life. That night became the first of many. A new routine began to form, one that wove itself into the fabric of my old one. Julian's truck would rumble to a stop in the evenings, and a few minutes later, there would be that soft, hesitant knock on my door. His work boots, caked with mud and grass, would end up by my door, a startlingly domestic sight next to my simple slippers. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we just existed in the same space, him reading a magazine, me working on a design, the silence between us no longer heavy or awkward, but comfortable, companionable. It was a silence filled with the quiet hum of his presence, a sound that my fortress had been missing all along. One weekend, he showed up with a toolbox. Your faucet is dripping, he announced, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. It's driving me crazy. I hadn't even noticed. I had lived with the sound for months, tuning it out like all the other imperfections. He spent an hour under my sink, swearing softly to himself, and when he was done, the drip was gone. The apartment was truly silent for the first time in ages. He had fixed something I didn't even know was broken. It felt like a metaphor for everything. We started making dinner together. My cooking, which had always been a solitary, functional act, became a collaboration. He was clumsy in the kitchen, all brute force and enthusiasm, but he was a willing student. We would bump into each other in the small space, the accidental touches no longer sending me into a panic, but eliciting a quiet smile, a lingering warmth. One night, after a particularly long day for him, he fell asleep on my couch. I watched him for a long time, the hard lines of his face softened in sleep, the constant tension gone from his jaw. I covered him with a blanket and went to my own bed, but I couldn't sleep. The apartment felt wrong with us in separate rooms. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen, already making coffee. He looked up as I came in, a sheepish smile on his face. "Sorry for crashing, don't be," I said. "But the couch can't be comfortable." "You can. You can use the bed next time. It's big enough." The offer hung in the air, a massive, terrifying leap of faith. His smile softened. Yeah. I confirmed, my heart doing its familiar gymnastics. "Okay," he said softly. "Okay, Leo." And so my world changed. My fortress became a home. The quiet rooms were filled with his low laughter. The sterile order was disrupted by his muddy boots and the stray tools he'd leave behind. The solitude I had clung to for years was replaced by a connection so profound it fundamentally altered the person I was. He was the plot twist I never saw coming, the storm that wrecked my carefully constructed world only to help me rebuild it into something infinitely better, infinitely more real. Looking at him across the kitchen, his hair a mess, my coffee mug in his hand, I realized the man in the window hadn't been watching an antagonist. He'd been watching his future, waiting for a storm to finally bring it to his door. And I wouldn't have changed a thing.